In a recent video, I talked about how to read more books, but I want to shift the focus a little bit because I would argue that there's something even more valuable to you as a reader and perhaps as a person, and that is your ability to read well. Quantity isn't always quality, and you could read for several hours a day, every day, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to understand or connect with the heart and soul of what an author or a book is really saying. I'm reminded of Donna Tartt's novel, The Secret History. One of the characters, Julian Morrow, he said something like, "It's better to know one book intimately than to know 100 superficially." I believe in that, at least in spirit. And I believe that becoming a better reader is a worthwhile pursuit. So today I want to shift the focus from how you can read more to how you can read better. People have a lot of different ideas about what it means to be a good reader or a better reader. For me, it has nothing to do with being able to read faster. And a lot of people will also tell you that to be a good reader, you have to read the really hard and really challenging books. Now, challenging yourself matters, of course. And as you grow as a reader, you'll naturally gravitate toward, more demanding books. But becoming a good reader usually happens by working with material that's just beyond your current level. Challenging enough to stretch you a little bit, but not so difficult that comprehension becomes a problem. Reading extremely hard books tends to be what skilled readers can handle, after they've developed the necessary vocabulary or the attention or the processing ability. In that sense, reading very difficult books is more often the outcome of having strong reading skills rather than the primary method for building them. So when you boil it down, being a good reader is primarily about three different things. It's about understanding more, it's about remembering more, and then being able to do these two things flexibly across different kinds of texts. Now, another thing that you'll often hear people say is that you can build reading comprehension skills just by reading lots of books. And there are grains of truth to that. The more you read, the more vocabulary you absorb, the more familiar you become with how sentences and stories tend to work. But there's a limit to how far just simple exposure will take you. It helps, sure, but it helps slowly. And that kind of undirected practice mostly improves comprehension in a sort of broad or general way. But one thing that can really accelerate your progress is deliberate, focused practice. We have decades of research showing that when you focus on specific reading skills, things like summarizing or noticing how a text is organized or making inferences, your comprehension improves and it improves more quickly. And this holds true for adults or more developed readers as well. So my first suggestion is not just that you practice, but that you practice in a way that'll help you isolate those cognitive processes. Now, to help with this, for most people, I would recommend How to Read a Book by Adler and Van Doren. This is a classic. For me, it was assigned reading when I was an undergraduate, but honestly, I would recommend it for anyone, whether you're a student or a serious reader or even a casual reader. If you're interested in improving your reading comprehension, then this is a great resource. In a way, it kind of reads like a manual for active and intentional reading. The main gist of this is that reading isn't just one skill. It's really a set of progressively deeper levels of cognitive processing. So they structure the whole book around these levels. There's 4 of them altogether. And each has its own goals and its own techniques. And there's a lot here also for both fiction and nonfiction. It's a really fantastic resource. I can't recommend it enough. Making notes is probably the most effective thing you can do for remembering what you read. However, it's only going to help when you do something new with the information. Simply copying over sentences word for word, that's not really going to move the needle. You need to transform the text in some way. For example, you could write a basic one-page summary for each chapter, or maybe for the whole story, whenever you're finished. a really small and simple thing to do, but memory strengthens when you have to reconstruct the story and the characters in your own mind. Other things you could do is maybe restate an idea from the book in your own words, or you could jot down a quick reaction, or you could pose questions about what you're reading, make inferences. Those moments of mental effort are what's going to make the story stick. And the same is true for underlining and highlighting. I mean, don't get me wrong, I underline too. There's nothing wrong with that. But on its own, that kind of passive marking has a surprisingly small effect on long-term memory. So if you do mark or highlight something on a page, follow it up with a brief note in the margin, or even some kind of symbol that you've designated in advance to kind of note something that's meaningful, an asterisk or a question mark. Anything that leaves a breadcrumb trail for your mind to return to later. But keep it simple. You want to still enjoy reading without making it feel like homework. You just want a visible record of your thinking. Now, another thing that you can do that has really nothing to do with note-taking, but another thing that you can do is spread your reading out across several different sessions instead of trying to cram it all into a single long session. And when you do this, you're taking advantage of what psychologists call the spacing effect. It sounds a little counterintuitive, but actually a little forgetting between sessions is actually good for memory, because each time you return to the book, your brain has to reconstruct the ideas. It has to reconstruct the characters and kind of rebuild the world. And that act of rebuilding is what makes the memory stick. So if you're like me and you actually enjoy reading during these really long and uninterrupted sessions, try to take a break once in a while. Get some air, make some coffee, make some tea. Just spend a few moments reflecting on what you've read. Even brief, spaced out sessions create stronger, more durable understanding than one giant push. Different types of books make different demands on your attention. You don't read a poem the same way that you read a mystery novel. And you wouldn't read philosophy the same way you would, say, a memoir. And even within fiction, a plot-driven thriller asks for something very different than, say, Toni Morrison or Virginia Woolf. One of the easiest ways to start practicing this is simply to notice what kind of text you're reading and then let that shape your approach. For example, with plot-heavy fiction, you might focus on maybe tracking events or character motivations. What do people want? What do they fear? What do they choose? With literary fiction, your attention might shift toward language or theme or symbolism. And then with nonfiction, you might look for structure, how arguments are built, how evidence is organized, or what problem is the author trying to solve. I mentioned How to Read a Book earlier. Not only is this a great resource for the kind of focus practice I mentioned already, but it's also an excellent guide for helping you understand these different types of books. For example, how to read practical books, how to read imaginative literature, reading stories, plays, and poems, how to read history, how to read science and mathematics, how to read philosophy, how to read social science. This is a wonderful guide for how to navigate all of those different kinds of books. I can't recommend it enough. And it's great because it does get easier. Over time, your brain begins to recognize these patterns automatically. When you encounter a dense passage, you'll naturally slow down. Or when you hit a familiar genre, you'll pick up cues more quickly. When the writing gets abstract or philosophical, you'll instinctively switch to a more critical or reflective mode. Ultimately, being a flexible reader is about awareness. Awareness of the text, awareness of your thinking, an awareness of when to lean in and when to slow down. And that's when reading becomes not only easier, but richer and deeper and far more rewarding.